Hey, I'm bringing back about 10 colleagues for an after party, so get things ready, okay? Just because you're in your final month of pregnancy doesn't mean you can't handle this, and make sure there are some desserts the ladies will enjoy. Exhausted from taking care of 2-year-old twins and being in my final month of pregnancy, my body was at its limit. My husband, indifferent to child care and firmly believing it was a woman's job, lost his temper when I understandably refused due to the short notice. Reluctantly preparing, I lay down in the nursery to put the twins to sleep. 5 hours later, one of the drunk colleagues stumbled into the nursery and was shocked. "I didn't know you had young kids and a pregnant wife. Did you trick us?" he shouted, raising his fist toward my husband. With one remark from my husband, the enjoyable after-party turned into chaos. I married my husband at 28. It was a whirlwind romance, and we married within a few months. Unable to quit my job immediately, we agreed I'd hand over my duties and resign upon becoming pregnant. My husband always wanted me to be a homemaker. However, we didn't actively try for kids, and for the first year, we enjoyed a typical newlywed life. I became pregnant just before turning 30, and true to our agreement, left my job to become a full-time homemaker. Upon learning of the twins, my husband was excited about becoming a father of 2. He eagerly told everyone about our growing family. Due to the twins and it being my first pregnancy, I was advised to have a managed hospital stay. My husband agreed, fearing it might be too late if something went wrong. However, I was worried about the household during my stay, as my husband was nearly incapable of housework. This concern was alleviated by my in-laws' suggestion. The options were for my mother-in-law to regularly check on my husband or for him to stay at his parents' until my return. He chose the latter. I safely delivered the twins via C-section. My discharge was a grand affair attended by my husband, in-laws, and parents. Nurses commented on how happy our family seemed. But once we got home, my husband's attitude changed. "Good to be back in my own house and away from my mom's nagging," he said. I was taken aback, expecting our parents to stay, but they suggested we have some family time alone. My in-laws left, and my parents returned to their hotel. My husband, complaining of a sore shoulder, left me with the babies and the luggage. Thankfully, he held one twin briefly but soon placed them on the sofa, demanding tea. I set up the baby's sleeping area first. In pain, I arranged a place for the twins to sleep. This was just the beginning of my husband's disinterest in parenting. The next day, my parents arrived early. "Kids first, then everything else, right?" My mom said, speaking from experience. Indeed, I was prioritizing the twins and my husband, leaving my own needs last. My in-laws arrived around noon, having already seen my mother's efforts and realizing the extent of twin care. From then on, parenting became a joint effort with both sets of grandparents. My father-in-law and father were still working, so my mother-in-law and mother couldn't always prioritize the twins. With my parents living out of state, it was clear we'd rely heavily on my in-laws. They adored the twins, never faulted my inexperience, and reassured me to take things slowly. "It's a time to learn what being a mother means from our children, so there's no need to regret what you can't do," they said, which was very reassuring. Having my mother come over for the weekends from out of state and my mother-in-law helping during weekdays was incredibly motivating. Men might find it hard to get involved in childcare, but it can be enjoyable once they take the first step, as told by my father-in-law from his own experience. My own father shared how nervous he was when he first took me out. However, despite hearing these stories, my husband showed no interest, responding with just "ha" or "really." Moreover, his attitude worsened in the absence of my parents, leading to my in-laws losing their patience. He complained about being hungry and demanded a proper meal while I was breastfeeding the twins. He criticized the use of ready meals and insisted on a home-cooked meal, as it's a homemaker's duty. It's not like I'm using ready meals all the time, I said, but he seemed dissatisfied even if just one item was a ready meal. He viewed the use of ready meals as slacking off in housework. You're not a child. If you're hungry, make something yourself. Babies can't feed themselves. Why don't you suggest taking turns breastfeeding with formula milk instead of demanding a cooked meal? My husband was initially shocked when scolded by my in-laws. If I cook, there'd be nothing left for a full-time homemaker to do, and if I breastfeed, what's left for a mother to do? My in-laws and I were astounded by his response. What followed was a barrage of lectures from my mother-in-law and basic child care lessons from my father-in-law. My husband reluctantly helped but remained sullen throughout. For the next 2 years, until I became pregnant with our third child, he used work as an excuse to avoid child care. In front of my parents, his excuses worked, but with my in-laws, they didn't, so he participated in child care, albeit grudgingly. During my second pregnancy, I suffered from severe morning sickness. Even my husband, seeing my obvious discomfort, couldn't demand anything and started doing more household chores and child care. This was partly thanks to my in-laws' initial guidance. However, he gradually began finding excuses not to do them. The turning point was when he cooked a meal that wasn't very tasty. Mistakes happen, and I appreciated his effort and tried to eat as much as I could but couldn't finish it due to feeling unwell. He took this as a silent accusation of his cooking being inedible. Feeling that his efforts were futile, he started to think it was a waste of his time. Once he began cutting corners, his dedication quickly faded, and it didn't even last a month. Now he spends his weekends enjoying his hobbies and often comes home late on weekdays due to work or social engagements. There were days when we barely saw each other. Still, I asked him to come home earlier or to spend at least one weekend day at home. I didn't need him to take care of me, just to spend time with the twins. You've been parenting for 2 years now, so you're probably used to it, right? Plus, it's your second time giving birth, and this time it's just one baby. There's nothing left for me to do, he said, and left to enjoy his hobbies. Lately, the 2-year-old twins had become more sensitive to our attitudes. They seemed to sense something was amiss from my husband's tone and my facial expressions. I let out a sigh of disappointment. Why did I get pregnant with a third child in such a situation? I couldn't stop questioning myself. Occasionally, my husband showed a kind side, despite his lack of cooperation in childcare. When he sought physical intimacy, I felt reassured that he was still interested in me, but I also complied to avoid upsetting him and creating problems. Looking back, I realized this was a vicious cycle that led to our current situation. It's not that I dislike the baby growing inside me. In fact, I'm happy about the pregnancy, but I felt like this wasn't the right time. Feeling the baby move inside me was endearing. I would stroke my belly and apologize for being a weak mom, promising to become stronger and asking the baby to be born healthy soon. It was decided that this birth would also be a C-section. I had to be admitted to the hospital in line with the due date, and there were preparations to be made. Most importantly, I needed my husband's help to take care of the twins while I was hospitalized. I couldn't ask him to take time off work, but I hoped he could at least help in the evenings. However, he said he couldn't make such a commitment because work was unpredictable. The idea of a man taking time off for his wife's childbirth embarrassed him. His words left me speechless. Before I could say anything, he cut me off with a demand for dinner. Let's not revisit that topic. The twins are 2 now. They can eat when they're hungry. Really? Then a 30-some man should be more capable of feeding himself than a 2-year-old. Why don't you show the kids how it's done? I'm fine. It's my earnings that keep this family going. You should be making me a grateful dinner as a sign of appreciation. His logic was infuriating. As my pregnancy progressed, the strain on my back increased, slowing down my movements. He criticized my housework as being slow or lacking enthusiasm. His favorite phrase lately was, I'm the one providing for this family. He was the one who insisted on me being a homemaker once I got pregnant, despite my preference for working. Of course, I agreed to his insistence, but the idea of him providing for us was hard to accept. As I approached the 36th week of pregnancy, my movements became even slower, and his words grew harsher. His complete lack of consideration infuriated me, but fearing harm to my body, I refrained from arguing back. I kept my urge to argue in check and absorbed the unkind words from my husband. The 38th week of my pregnancy, scheduled for a C-section, was quickly approaching. Rethink the C-section. The last time was twins, so it was unavoidable, but this time it's just one, right? Wouldn't you feel more fulfillment giving birth naturally? My husband didn't understand anything. Giving birth is risking one's life. His opinions and preferences are irrelevant. So a C-section means early hospitalization and a longer stay. Basically, you're choosing a C-section because you want to avoid housework, right? I couldn't comprehend how he concluded that choosing a C-section equates to wanting to avoid housework. I patiently explained the risks to both mother and baby. If my explanation wasn't clear, I suggested he could hear it from the doctor, but he wouldn't listen. "You're bad at explaining," he said. "Why should I take time out of my schedule to hear about C-sections? It's not me who's giving birth." I explained why a C-section was chosen because he labeled it as a way to avoid housework, yet he dismissed it as irrelevant and ended the conversation. On the day of my admission, I tried to get his understanding to avoid any obstruction, but he snapped at me, calling me persistent. Amidst this, my husband unexpectedly called. He said he's bringing 10 colleagues home for an after-party and asked me to prepare food, including desserts that women would enjoy. Before we had kids, my husband used to bring colleagues over to our house for drinks. Back then, it was enjoyable to share good times with them, even though they were his colleagues. After I got pregnant, the frequency of these gatherings gradually decreased, especially after the twins were born. It never happened. According to my husband, he invites them, but they hesitate because of the twins. It seems his colleagues were hesitant about having a gathering at a house with young twins. In essence, they were being considerate. The twins are still 2 years old and need constant attention. I couldn't understand why these considerate colleagues would suddenly decide to come over in a group of 10. I'm about to be hospitalized, and labor could start any time. Preparing a meal for guests in such a condition is impossible. I told my husband that it's unreasonable to expect me to do so, especially at this time without prior notice. I suggested, even if it goes a bit over budget, to have the after-party at a different place. He's often generous with his colleagues and juniors, though it could be seen as showing off. There was even a time he spent a few thousand in one day on drinks. I pleaded with him not to bring them home this time, even if it was costly. But my husband snapped back in anger. "You said we were going to do it at my house. Are you trying to embarrass me?" He insisted that a wife should support her husband's image and follow his lead. He was adamant about taking me along and having me prepare everything. I didn't have the energy to argue anymore and felt it would be easier to just do as told. It was impossible to go shopping at this hour, so I warned him I could only make do with what we had and prepared a meal for 10 people. I was glad I had bought extra ingredients, anticipating a situation like this. However, I used them all up tonight and would have to shop again tomorrow. I wondered if I'd be able to go. While cooking, I felt my belly getting tense. My husband also told me to hide in the room with the twins and keep quiet once everything was ready. So I did just that. When I started putting the twins to bed, my husband returned home with 10 colleagues. Their noise woke the twins, but I quietly asked them to stay quiet and put them back to sleep. Watching the twins sleep, I felt relieved, but then the pain in my belly started to worry me. I almost let out a cry, but covered my mouth with both hands and stayed hidden. The pain got worse and more distinct. This might be a serious situation. Just then, the door suddenly opened. Sorry, I mistook this for the bathroom. Apparently, a drunk colleague had opened the door by mistake. In the room were the sleeping twins and me, a pregnant woman barely holding back a groan of pain. I brushed it off, telling him to enjoy himself without worrying about me, as I knew him from previous visits. Don't worry about us, he stuttered, leaving the room. From the living room, I heard his angry voice. Hey, what are you doing leaving your little kids and wife alone? And isn't your wife pregnant? She must be due soon, right? I thought they were aware of the situation to some extent when they came. I had assumed they were being considerate until now, so why this sudden change? Maybe they were joking around after a few drinks and my husband took it seriously. I believed it had reached this point because once my husband agreed to it, he couldn't back down. Prioritizing appearances, he got angry and demanded that I comply. However, from the colleagues' conversation, it didn't seem that way. He had been declining invitations to a house with small kids, so my husband kept inviting him, disregarding the refusals. The colleague felt guilty for coming so late at night to a house with kids and a pregnant woman. A colleague said, I was told you and the kids were at your parents' house and that your husband was alone, so no need to worry. Believing that, 10 colleagues came to our house for an after-party. I told you to hide so you wouldn't be seen. If you were seen, it can't be helped. She always uses excuses, like taking care of the twins or being pregnant and close to delivering to skip household chores. I had to make her cook at least one meal for 10 people at once. Considering how much she has been slacking, it's still not enough. My husband said this with a voice full of confidence, as if he believed what he was doing was right. Cooking for 10 people at this hour, an unusual voice echoed. Curious, I left the room, worried about what my enraged husband might do. There are people who act like tyrants at home, but pretend to be reasonable in public. I couldn't say for sure if my husband was that type, but knowing him at home, I had no idea what he might do now. Peeking into the living room, I saw a colleague grabbing my husband by the shirt. Even the drunken colleagues were trying to calm him down, saying he was going too far. However, the angry colleague explained why he couldn't calm down, and those who were defending my husband started looking at him suspiciously. Several colleagues who also had children the same age as the twins expressed their disbelief and scorn towards my husband. Female colleagues said, from my perspective, it was unforgivable, calling him the worst kind of husband. Voices suggested disbanding the gathering, and some colleagues started to tidy up. When my husband was called the worst as both a husband and a father, he shrank from his previously arrogant demeanor and was unable to retort. Several colleagues noticed me and apologized, moving to a nearby sofa to ease my body. I realized that the pain in my stomach was coming at regular intervals. Certain it was labor, I sought help from my husband, who was being scolded and shrinking away. He didn't respond. A colleague noticed and asked if I needed to call the hospital. When I nodded, they handed me the cordless phone. I managed to call the hospital, and they told me to come right away. I had my hospital bag ready in the bedroom, and as I attempted to get up to fetch it, a female colleague offered to get it for me. I agreed. Honestly, during labor at this hour, my husband was useless. His spirit was broken. I wondered if it was right to call my in-laws to take care of the twins. How many times had I wished we lived near my parents? I could have asked my own parents without any hesitation. If you're going to go by yourself, I thought. And if you call an ambulance, tell them not to use the siren. It'd be embarrassing if the neighbors found out. It was his fault things turned sour because his lies were exposed. I was doing exactly as my worthless husband said, staying quietly locked in the room. After all, lies are bound to be uncovered, especially men's lies, which are often poorly crafted. I wanted to lash out in anger, but my body couldn't handle the stress. As I was suppressing my urge to speak out, I heard the sound of something being struck. Looking towards the noise, I saw one of my husband's colleagues, someone I also knew, slapping my husband across the face. "I never thought you were such a rotten person. Giving birth is a matter of life and death," the colleague yelled. "You've hit me. I've never even been hit by my parents," my husband shouted back. His face turned beet red, and his ears were red too. He seemed deeply humiliated. "Sorry for asking too much of someone who doesn't know pain to show empathy. Listen, the pain your wife is experiencing is far beyond this. Why am I the only one being blamed? I'm not in the wrong. After all, I'm the one supporting them," my husband argued, saying I embarrassed him in public and that he was not to blame. He even shouted at the colleague who slapped him, threatening to sue for assault. However, none of the colleagues were listening to him anymore. They told him to go ahead and sue if he wanted and asked me what I needed. With all the commotion, the twins woke up. They were scared, seeing all the unknown adults and hearing the raised voices, and started crying. I was overwhelmed, taking care of myself and now having to calm the twins too, which honestly frustrated me. In such a time, a useless husband who prioritizes his pride is unnecessary. Just as I was thinking of calling my in-laws for help, a female colleague and a colleague with children offered to take care of the twins. I was grateful. I accepted their offer. The woman mentioned she often took care of her nieces and nephews, and the man said his kids were around the same age as the twins. I told them the twins' room had plenty of toys. There were no food allergies to worry about, and they could use any food in the house. I also mentioned my mother-in-law was supposed to come in the morning, but I would ask her to come earlier. Some colleagues who had experienced childbirth suggested taking a taxi would be faster. They tried calling one, but it was going to take a while. Then one colleague mentioned he had a subordinate living nearby who wasn't at the gathering. This subordinate, also a father of a young child, rushed over after being called. His wife, understanding the situation, urged him to leave quickly. I think it was a made-up story, but I appreciated the thoughtful gesture. My husband kept insisting on his righteousness, but the colleague and I ignored him. The colleague's subordinate drove me to the hospital, and a female colleague who came with me said she would stay until my in-laws or parents arrived. I expressed my gratitude as she even contacted my parents and in-laws on my behalf. Despite having work the next day, she insisted it was fine and stayed with me until my in-laws arrived. My parents, who lived out of state, arrived the next morning. They missed the cesarean delivery but were relieved to hear that both mother and child were safe. The real turmoil began once everything settled down. When my in-laws and parents learned the woman who called them was my husband's colleague, they suspected infidelity. They were curious about the circumstances under which the alleged mistress had contacted them, but decided to rush to the hospital first. Upon arriving and hearing the full story, they were shocked to realize the situation was far more serious than an affair. At the hospital, noticing the absence of my husband, my in-laws assumed he was at home taking care of the twins. They felt somewhat relieved, thinking that although he failed as a husband, he was fulfilling his duties as a father. However, the reality was that my colleagues were taking care of the twins, and I had been forced to cook for 10 people while nearing childbirth. My in-laws apologized to me and my parents for my husband's misbehavior. They suggested it would be better for me if my parents stayed and quickly left to deal with my husband. The scene they encountered at our home was appalling. By the time they arrived, all of my husband's colleagues except the 2 who had offered to look after the twins had gone home. The remaining colleagues were busy taking care of the twins and cleaning up after the gathering. My husband was sulking in a corner, drinking beer from a can. My mother-in-law handed over some taxi fare and a small token of thanks to the 2 remaining colleagues and said she wanted to apologize and thank them properly later. She didn't think money could solve it, but at that moment, it was the only way she could show her gratitude and apology. Later, my in-laws thanked all of my husband's colleagues. When it was just my husband, his parents, and the twins, my mother-in-law took the twins out for a walk. She probably didn't want to show the kids their father getting scolded. When they returned home, my husband's cheek was even more swollen. It seems my husband took a solid hit from his father. He looked like he had lost his soul after that lecture, yet he still insisted he did nothing wrong. Even when I came home with our third child, he never changed his mind. In front of his parents, he acted obedient, but once they left, he reverted to his old self. With 2-year-old twins and a newborn, I couldn't free up my hands, yet he kept ordering me around. He even blamed me, saying his father hit him because I was an inadequate wife. It was too much to handle. I decided to divorce him and informed my parents and in-laws. My parents were completely in favor and had already told me to return home before I was discharged from the hospital. My in-laws, disappointed in their son, didn't oppose the divorce and apologized for the trouble he caused. My husband was the only one against it. He consulted his colleagues, but they were surprised I hadn't asked for a divorce earlier and supported my decision. Rumors started at his workplace about an incident during a home party he hosted. The day after the party, a few people, including my husband, were absent or late to work. My in-laws even went to his workplace to apologize. It seems my husband did something to his colleagues. Seeing both his parents apologize made people speculate about what he had done. Meanwhile, news of my safe delivery spread among the colleagues who attended the party, and they speculated that my husband messed up because of it. This rumor, though not entirely accurate, spread, and he was looked down upon at work. Eventually, he left his job, realizing the gravity of his actions too late. Initially, he agreed to the divorce in anger, but after quitting his job and returning to his parents' house, he couldn't find peace. He begged me to reconsider, saying our home was his sanctuary, but I had already moved back to my parents' house with our children. I had no time for a man I had given up on. He couldn't find a job and was eventually kicked out of his parents' house. With no money and mounting child support and alimony payments, he resorted to borrowing from dangerous sources, leading to a life of being chased by debt collectors. Now he's stuck in a tough job with shady lenders, barely making enough to repay his debts. I returned to my parents' house and raised our children with their help. I still keep in touch with my ex-husband's colleagues and parents. The twins wanted to see the big sister and brother who played with them back then, so I reached out, not expecting much, but we reconnected. I owe my current happiness to those 10 people. I've started socializing with some of them, sharing our parenting woes. My in-laws were always good to me, and the twins were fond of them. My parents had a good relationship with them too, so they regularly visit the twins and the new baby. This experience made me realize life is about helping each other out. I won't forget the gratitude I felt and plan to become even happier with my precious family.